one that has plagued New Zealand as perhaps our biggest social failing. Nonetheless, the fact remains that right now we have 25,000 applicants who cannot get a kāinga or a home. And unfortunately, the sustaining tenancies policy of successive governments has meant that people who terrorise their neighbours with wildly antisocial and sometimes violent behaviour face almost no consequences. In the year from February 2022 to earlier this year, Kāinga Ora received 10,000 complaints and yet made only a handful, numbering in the dozens, only a few dozen proper complaints proper responses that would move towards evicting a person from a kāinga or a tenancy. I think it's a simple question of values. If a public house is a privilege paid for by taxpayers, then surely the priority should be for those people waiting on the waiting list who have not offended or terrorised their neighbours to be given priority, and for people who misuse and abuse the neighbourhood in which their public housing is found should be moved out of those houses in favour of people who aren't terrorising their neighbours. It's a simple question of values. It doesn't solve the underlying problem that there are not enough houses. We need to solve that problem separately, but in terms of current prioritisation, that should be for people who make good neighbours. Those are the bones of the policy. Obviously happy to have any further discussion, and hope you're all having a good time on the campaign trail.
Where do those people go?
Exactly where the 25,000 people who are currently awaiting a public house go. They may be sleeping with relatives, they may be in some sort of shelter, they may be living in someone's garage. That is the sad reality. The question, that's where people are right now. The question is, if you get the privilege of going to a taxpayer-funded public house, then should you be somebody who's abusing their neighbours, spitting and urinating? These are sadly the reality, the complaints that neighbours have from kāinga ora tenants. And by not having any priority for people who are good neighbours, kāinga ora is aiding and abetting that antisocial behaviour. No, I'm not happy with that at all. It's the reality. The question is, should it be people who actually haven't done anything wrong, who have that difficult position, or should it be people who've actually had the chance and abused their neighbours? I'm not happy with people having their neighbours abusing, urinating and spitting on them, but that's the reality for some people. I think that once you say that it's a privilege to have a taxpayer-funded home, then suddenly you actually have some values that align with those values of the people paying the taxes and paying the bill. That's absolutely true, and it's also true of those 25,000 currently on a waiting list. Well, if your starting point is that there were 10,000 complaints, I don't expect that you'd have 10,000 complaints if people knew that there were real consequences for behaviour. But too much of what's happened over the last 6 years under this government is that there's no consequences for doing things bad, and people who try to do well get beaten down. So people who patiently follow the rules and wait on the waiting list get nowhere. People who terrorise their neighbourhood are given what's called a sustained tenancy. That's going to be a matter between the landlord and the tenant.
It's got to be some kind of limit on it, right?
Well, clearly it would be limited to within a few weeks' rent at the absolute maximum. I mean, no one's going to pay it if it's beyond that. But ultimately, rents and bonds are both set in the marketplace, the bonds being a multiple of the rent.
What are you going to do to make sure it's not abused? Like, pay a pet bond for having a goldfish?
Well, right now, you actually don't have any kind of choice to pay a pet bond and have your pet put in place. So I can't see people abusing that any more than they would just raise the rent. It wouldn't really make sense to raise the pet bond versus the rent. What it does do is it reflects the additional cleaning costs and other misgivings that landlords may have about someone having a pet.
There was a quote that was read out from Chris Hipkins to Kristen Luxon last night in the debate. It was a quote from New Zealand's first candidate speaking about Māori. It is, "Cry if you want to, we don't care, you pushed it too far, and we are the party with the cultural mandate and the courage to cut out your disease and bury you permanently." Is that simple?
Well, I wouldn't accept that, no.
So then would you look at New Zealand First together?
Well, this is the reason why I've said that we'll work with the Parliament the people give us. That's respecting the election result. We have to do that. However, I've also been clear that I don't see myself sitting around a cabinet table with anyone other than the National Party. And as the polls showed, we're one seat away from a stable, reliable ACT National coalition.
But right now, you could put a government with that person in power, so would you not? Would you have shut?
Well, it's pretty clear from ACT that we want an ACT national government that can turn around the serious problems that this country faces. The alternative, as you see with quotes like that, is not going to deal with the economy, the crime, the division this country faces. We just need that stable ACT national government, two parties that are being very clear they can work together. Look, I completely disagree with the tweets that he's liked. I don't know what he was thinking or why he liked them, or if it was because he liked the person that did the tweet, or if he'd actually read the content. I don't know. But it's pretty clear my track record on those issues is that I'm a social liberal and accepting of all people. Beg your pardon? Yes, he is.
Why don't you just ask us what he was doing then?
It's not a bad point. I haven't discussed it with him. I could do that.
Probably a couple of days ago when the story broke, would be a good time to do that.
Well, you could argue if you wanted to.
You said when you spoke before that landlords are less willing to be landlords because of the current rules in place, because this makes it harder for them. Do you think it's really what's stopping people becoming landlords, or is it the cost of housing right now?
Well, of course, the cost of housing is ultimately passed on to tenants. The question for somebody who's deciding to invest, they're thinking, well, should I invest in the share market, or should I invest in a rental property to rent out? The more rules and regulations you put on residential tenancies, the more likely they are to choose another choice of investment. Similarly, if someone has a house and they're thinking, do I sell it, do I rent it out, or do I live in it myself? The more rules and regulations you put on residential tenancies, the less likely they are to rent it out. So every time the government does something they think will help tenants by making it harder to be a landlord, they actually make it less likely there'll be more homes on the market for tenants to rent.
And so in terms of that, your solution is to build more houses. Can you tell me what ACT's plan is? How many houses do we need? Like, where are they going to go? What is the plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we put together a housing policy that we released, I think, 2 years ago. Fundamentally, it's a supply-side policy. It's about resource management law. It's about infrastructure funding, as we're discussing over here. It's about all of the costs that people face when building a home. We estimate that based on demographic demand, the backlog that's built up, and the fact that some homes just wear out and need to be replaced every year, that New Zealand needs to build 51,000 homes per year for 5 years to fill the current backlog, and then carry on at a slightly slower rate of about 45,000 thereafter. We've only reached that level of home building once in our history, and therefore we're going to have to really get our skates on as far as home building. But that in a way is
How are we going to get the skates on to do that? Because saying we need that many houses is one thing, but we actually want to see those houses built so there's more options for renters and landlords.
Yeah, well, in fairness to ACT, I mean, we can't really be accused of not setting out detailed policy on things like resource management and infrastructure funding and financing and building materials and building inspections. I mean, we've got a pretty comprehensive set of policies there, which I'm happy to go through with you, but I know that these folks have covered that a few times before. Yeah.
Did you keep a tally of how much money Chris spent in the New South Leaders debate last night? They committed to lowering the age of bowel screening, committed to matching GP nurses' pay to hospital nurses' pay, but we won't get a church tax.
Well, actually the only party that's put out a fully costed alternative budget, which shows things are going to be tight. Did they?
Yesterday.
Oh, do they? I didn't realise that they'd done the whole thing. I think they showed a small number of changes that they would make. We've gone line by line through the whole budget and shown how we do things differently. And when you do that, what you find is that New Zealand is going to face a very tough time balancing its government budget. It's not a time to throw around spending promises. There are some areas we need to spend more. Access, we need to spend more on local infrastructure. We need to spend more on teachers and prisons and GPs and defence. But outside of that, the next government is going to have to be saving money. And while I think, can